Let's imagine two families living in two different eras. One in the 1960s living on one income, and another in the 2020s living on two incomes. The family from the 1960s can afford a home, good quality groceries, pay the bills on time, and still have money left over to save. The family from today, though, can't afford a home, can barely afford groceries, is struggling to keep up with bills, and relies on credit cards for emergencies. Despite having nearly double the income, the middle class is poorer than it was 50 years ago, and in this video I want to explain why that is, how two incomes made the middle class poorer than one. And so let's start off by looking back at that family from the 60s and try to figure out what made their lives so affordable. Chapter 1, The World on One Income. Now, in order to understand why this happened, we first need to visualize what the lifestyle looked like that was supported on one income. A typical house in the 1960s was 1,500 square feet with a layout that might look like this. 3 small bedrooms squeezed together, 1.5 bathrooms, a small kitchen/dining room, a small living room, and a single-car garage. Now notice how in this floor plan, there is no master suite, no separate dining room, no walk-in closets, no laundry room, no home office, no 2-car garage, and minimal storage space. The home that income supported was about half the size of homes today, and when it came to cars in the 1960s, 21% of families had no vehicles, 57% had 1 car, 19% had 2, and 3% had 3 or more. Most families were single-car families, and when it came to vacationing, flying was too expensive, and so the average family vacationed at things that were close by. If you lived in the West, you probably visited National Park. If you lived in the Midwest, you probably camped by a lake. And if you lived on the East Coast, you probably went to the beach. And when it came to the overall household budget in 1960, 30% went to housing, 20% went to food, and 15% went to transportation. The other 25% went to everything else: utilities, healthcare, clothing, and other basic necessities. And that is what the lifestyle looked like that was supported off of one income. However, the truth is that statement, the single income middle class, is actually a very misleading statement. Because although one person was earning an income, there were 2 people in the household working. One of them, though, wasn't getting paid. And so let's talk about that person. Chapter 2, The Domestic Engineer. Now, the biggest myth of the single income middle class is that there was only one worker in the household, but that is not true. The household didn't run on one worker, but it ran on 2. One person made the money, and the other made sure less of it was spent. And that second job was called the domestic engineer, or more commonly known as the housewife. Without the domestic engineer, the single-income middle class wouldn't stand a chance, because while the husband was off earning an income, the wife was running the operations of the household. And while that job might sound insignificant, man did it make a difference. The domestic engineer cooked breakfast, packed everyone's lunches, and had dinner ready by 6. Eliminating the need to ever eat out, she planned groceries to prevent waste, cleaned the house, did the laundry, managed schedules, errands, and often budgeting, saving time and money. But perhaps the biggest benefit of having a domestic engineer was providing childcare, taking care of the children during the day and after school. That single expense nowadays costs dual-income households $15,000 a year per child. The domestic engineer might have not made any money, but that role saved the household so much money throughout the year. And so while on the surface it might have looked like one income supported the middle class, in reality it was this combination of that income, a modest life, and a domestic engineer. However, eventually, the country started to change, and having 2 incomes in a household became more common. And let's talk about why that happened. Chapter 3, Confronting the Power Dynamic. Now, while the one-income, two-worker system worked financially, it came with a trade-off. If just one person earned the income, then the other person was financially dependent on them. And that fact created a power dynamic. Firstly, the man's role was viewed as superior, despite both doing important work. Secondly, although they were married, it was still his money, and so if she wanted something, she had to ask permission for it. And thirdly, the man's role was structured with clear boundaries, start at 9 and finish at 5. The woman's domestic role had no defined limits, and she was always on. But beyond the household, that dependence was reinforced by the system itself. Prior to 1974, a woman didn't have the legal right to open up a checking account, access credit, or take on a loan without the approval from a man, whether that was her husband, father, or brother. Which is a crazy thing to think about because 1974 wasn't that far away. That means that my grandma, who is still living today, didn't have the legal right to open up a checking account until she was 36, and my great-grandma was 66. And so while on the surface this system might have worked, it left the women heavily dependent on the men. And one of the first times that this norm was challenged was during World War II. Due to the men leaving the war, women started to enter the workforce in mass numbers to fill those roles. But after the war, once the men returned home, many of these women were pushed back into their old domestic roles. However, many of them didn't want to be a housewife anymore. Once you experience what life is like with your own income, routines, and to participate in the economy, it's impossible to go back. And so throughout the 60s and 70s, we started to see the rise of women movements, fighting for equality and challenging gender norms. And as a result, there was a variety of legislation passed. The Equal Pay Act of 1963 aimed to address wage differences between men and women. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 made it illegal to discriminate in hiring based on race and gender. And the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974 ensured women could apply for credit of their own. And although these things didn't solve the problem overnight, they were the first steps that not only allowed women to participate in the economy, but to build lives that weren't financially dependent on men. And that is one of the major reasons why households now have 2 incomes. And once that happened, the economy fundamentally changed. Chapter 4, Supply and Demand, Dual Income Edition. Now, in theory, having 2 incomes should make life easier because now you have nearly double the income. However, as more and more households started to have dual incomes, naturally the market started to demand more money from people, and the cost of certain things started to increase. And that is because of the basic economic principle of supply and demand. When supply is high and demand is low, prices are often pushed down. But when demand is high and supply is low, prices are often pushed up. And nowhere did this play out more clearly than housing. For example, houses are a limited resource. And so the price of them is not based on what they cost, but on what people are willing to pay. And once households started to have more and more money, the price of them naturally started to increase. And let me explain how. Imagine 2 single-income households, both looking at the same house for $200,000. Both have about the same budget. The first family might bid $200,000 and the second bids $202,000, and they get it. But now, let's imagine that one of those families starts to earn 2 incomes. They can now easily outbid the other family at $210,000 and get the house. And so now, if that single income family wants to buy a home, they now need a second income. And finally, let's imagine 2 two-income households competing for the same house. Because they both have more income and both really want the house, they might get in this bidding war where it starts at $200,000. One bids $210,000, the second bids $225,000, the first family goes back at $250,000, and the second family walks, and the first family gets the house. And so now that $200,000 house costs $250,000 because housing is a limited resource, and now people have more money to pay for the households. And so what started as an advantage eventually became an expectation. The second income didn't make life more affordable, but it gave the market permission to charge more. And once prices started to adjust to 2 incomes, life itself started to adjust as well. And what we started to see was a whole new set of expenses. Chapter 5, The New Necessities. Now, having a larger household budget didn't just increase prices, but it also created a lot of new expenses that didn't exist on a single income. For example, now you have to support 2 working lives. So you need 2 cars, 2 insurance policies, 2 gas budgets, and maybe 2 home offices, which can increase a household budget by hundreds or thousands of dollars a month. In addition, because people now have 2 professional lives, you might have 2 student loan payments, more meals on the go, more small daily expenses, and 2 professional wardrobes, again increasing the budget. But perhaps the biggest financial punch of having 2 incomes is childcare. When the wife is no longer home all day, young children need daycare, which can cost $15,000 a year, and older children might need after-school programs, which can cost over $5,000 a year. We didn't just add a second income, but we added a second set of obligations. And on top of these new necessities, something else happened that increased the cost of living. When both parties are working, there's a lot less time to be an adult. Chapter 6, Adulthood Without a Domestic Engineer. So as we discussed in Chapter 2, although only one person in the household was earning money, 2 people were working, the other was the domestic engineer. And that role accomplished a lot of the things that adults need to do that are not fun. But once both parties lived busy lives, a lot of these adult tasks started to be outsourced. For example, when there's no domestic engineer cooking, people are starting to get breakfast through the drive-thru, grab lunch out, and order Uber Eats after work. In fact, nowadays, people are spending a little bit more money eating out than they are on groceries. And that's just one example. When people start to live busier lives, they might outsource cleaning at $250 a clean, laundry at $50 for a fold and wash, yard work at $40 a week, and grocery delivery with a $15 fee. And in addition to outsourcing things, coordination as a couple becomes harder. You have 2 different calendars, so who runs the errands, who picks up the kids, who manages all the tasks. Relationships become harder, parenting becomes harder, and adulthood becomes harder. 2 incomes didn't just change what we earn, but it changed how we live our lives, which brings us to where we are today. Chapter 7, The Point of No Return. So when you tie all this together, higher prices, new expenses, and less time, something happens. You eventually reach this point of no return where the system stops depending on one income and starts depending on 2. Housing, childcare, and basic life costs start to be based around 2 incomes. And once people start to develop higher standards, like 2 cars, more home space, and more convenience, it's hard to go back to the lower standards. And once both parties get an education and build their careers, nobody wants to interrupt their careers and go back to more traditional norms. And to make matters worse, as this lifestyle has gotten more complex and dependent on 2 incomes, if one of those people loses their job, it impacts both of them because their budget is designed around 2 incomes. It's the point of no return. When we as a society switched to 2 incomes, it didn't make life easier. It made life a lot more complex and made people struggle a lot more financially. And so let's finish this video off with Chapter 8, Where do we go from here? So if this is the new world that we're living in, how do we navigate it? Well, I want to finish this video off with 3 mindsets that can help you get ahead in this world. 1, the big 3 are where the game is won. The biggest mistake that people make when it comes to budgeting is focusing on the small expenses, like cutting out the daily latte or the small daily expenses. And while those things can help, in the grand scheme of your budget, 3 things will determine whether or not you win in this economy. Your housing, transportation, and food, and childcare if you have kids. These expenses are 50 to 60% of a person's budget. Those 3 expenses are where the game is really played. Those expenses are what lock in your financial life month after month. And so if you focus on making those expenses manageable, you can go through life much more easily. 2, you can save money or you can save time, so choose intentionally. As I said, the real backbone of the middle class wasn't just a single income, but it was the housewife. The housewife did a lot of the tasks that saved the family a lot of time. Cooking meals, cleaning, doing the laundry, managing the home. But now we outsource those things to save us time, which costs us more money. In today's world, you're constantly making a trade-off. You can spend your time to save money or spend your money to save time. And the key nowadays is to intentionally choose what matters most to you. And finally, design your life on your own, or the system will do it for you. The world is a lot more complex than it used to be in the past, and if you want to live a successful life, you can't live your life on autopilot and let the system make all your decisions. You can't let the system determine the size of your house, the cars you drive, and the daily choices you make. Instead, it's important to intentionally design a life that is centered around your values. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a like, subscribe for more, and if you want to hear another very interesting story about the real reason boomers are retiring broke, give this video a watch next. And with that, muchas gracias, que tengan un buen día, nos vemos chicos.